Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? Our song this morning is in reality the finale of the Hamilton musical. The entire company looks back to make sense of the events that they have lived through. It's interesting that it starts with Washington because Washington died actually before Hamilton. After the election of 1796, he returned to his estate at Mount Vernon and passed away 2.5 years later on December 14th, 1799. Thomas Jefferson prevailed over John Adams and Aaron Burr in the presidential election of 1800. Incidentally, it was a tie in the Electoral College. Alexander Hamilton's endorsement and assistance in that election of Jefferson planted the seeds for the final disputes between he and Aaron Burr, culminating in the duel between them on July 11th, 1804. And Alexander Hamilton died the next day from his gunshot wounds. 2.5 years after losing their oldest son to gunshot wounds received in a duel, Eliza now experiences the loss of her husband under similar tragic circumstances. If we recall last week's song, we can imagine that for a second time, excuse me, for a second time, her grief is unimaginable. And as the finale proceeds, Lin-Manuel Miranda has Washington, Burr, Jefferson, Madison, and Angelica reflect on the life and the importance of Alexander Hamilton for our benefit. Washington's reflections are yet a further imparting of wisdom. Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? After Aaron Burr, Jefferson, and Madison share their reflections and Angelica appears, she offers what could be called a lament for Hamilton. Every other founding father story gets told. Every other founding father gets to grow old. And Aaron Burr seems to ask, who remembers your name, Alexander? Who carries the flame for you, Alexander? And that is when Eliza steps forward to tell us, I put myself back in the narrative. I stop wasting time on tears, and I live another 50 years. Eliza gives us a litany of all the things that she and Angelica have done to both remember Alexander's life and work, and how she herself builds a legacy for the Hamilton family. It is the two women left behind after Alexander's death who do the work of telling his story. And isn't that what we see in the life and death of Jesus? Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Salome, if we read Mark 16. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary in Matthew 28. The women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and other women in Luke 24, and Mary Magdalene in John 20. All four Gospels make the women make the amazing discovery that Jesus is no longer dead. He has been raised and he has gone ahead to meet them in Galilee. Even though they are terrified and stunned, after a time, they finally do begin to share the story of Jesus being raised and no longer being dead. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells the story of Jesus? Between the actual life of Jesus and the first recorded writings of his life and ministry, several generations go by. So we need to remember that the average lifespan of someone in the first century of the Common Era was most likely somewhere between 30 and 35 years. Most of the remembrances of Jesus, his sayings, his deeds, were passed down in the oral tradition from generation to generation. And actually, the first and earliest writings that are in the canon of Scripture that reference Jesus are actually the writings of the Apostle Paul. And those can be found in his correspondence with the Galatians and the Thessalonians, followed by other communities of faith that had sprung up in the areas where Paul and Barnabas had gone to do missionary work. Paul's writings and his interpretation of Jesus are a very different character than the narratives we find in the four Gospels. And when we consider the Gospels, each of the authors took the oral traditions available to them in their individual faith communities and constructed their own narratives of the life and ministry of Jesus. Their main purpose was not to create a historical record or write a biography of the life of Jesus. Rather, each in their own separate place wrote to make meaning, to interpret for their faith community what Jesus' sayings, teachings, and deeds meant for them in their context. Each gospel writer told the Jesus story with their own theology and interpretation of what God was doing in and through the life of Jesus. We need to be aware of those differences as we read each of the Christian scriptures, particularly the Gospels. Mark tells the story of Jesus in such a way that we understand both God's mighty acts in working through Jesus and that we are called to discipleship, to follow Jesus' way and live as he taught us. The gospel known as Mark is considered by scholars to be the first gospel narrative written down. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke follow the pattern of Mark, but they use additional sayings and stories to adapt their narratives to fit the communities that each was writing for. Matthew was writing to a Jewish Christian audience that was struggling for its identity and survival in the period after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. As the Jewish faith was reorganized away from its center on the temple and toward the local synagogues, tensions mounted for those that accepted the teachings about Jesus and those who did not. Matthew's gospel is written as what is called an apologetic, a defense of what his portion of the Jewish community believed. The Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are a third interpretation of the meaning of Jesus. This gospel builds on a foundation of Mark, again with additional sayings, parables, and deeds of Jesus. Luke urges us throughout to look for the manifestation of the reign of God and for the presence and the leading of the Holy Spirit in our lives. In Luke, we find Jesus working for the poor and the oppressed, those on the margins of society, reaching out to heal brokenness and disease, and repairing and renewing lives and relationships. We are taught that God seeks the good of all. The fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, is very different from the first three. It was written approximately a generation after the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke Acts. The author of the fourth gospel wrote both to call non-believers to faith and to encourage those who did believe in their faith. The Gospel of John has also been found to have many similarities with the Hellenistic or Greek philosophy that was dominant at the time of its composition. There are echoes of the philosophy of Plato and Platonic thought in Jesus speaking of himself as the true food and true vine, and insisting that he came from above, whereas his opponents were of this world. That dualistic thinking ultimately finds its roots in Platonic thought and philosophy, an indication of the intellectual and the philosophical background in which the author of this gospel composed his work. These four gospels and the writings of Paul offer a diversity of understandings and interpretations of the life and ministry of Jesus and their meaning for those of us left behind. If we only read the Gospel of Mark and we never heard the Gospel of John, we might not be concerned about what it meant to believe in Jesus or to be concerned only about our souls in the hereafter. Our emphasis in life and religious practice would be on a life of discipleship. How do we live out the way Jesus taught us to live? On the other hand, if we followed only the Gospel of Luke, our emphasis would be on working to see the rule, the kingdom, the basileia of God begin in this life and work for justice for the poor, the sick, the marginalized, the oppressed. We would end up being called gluttons and drunkards, just as Jesus was, and eating only with tax collectors and sinners, and be told we didn't have the correct beliefs. The Gospel of Matthew would have us be concerned with both law and gospel, living a scrupulously religious life, while at the same time working to make disciples of all the world. Who lives, who dies, who chooses to tell our story, and how they choose to remember us deeply impacts how we are remembered and what parts of our life and work are told. Several times throughout the musical, we hear the line, "History has its eyes on you." And we would do well to remember who it is that writes our history. From what perspective are they telling our story? What parts get told? What parts are left out? Are we observed through the rose-colored lens of an admirer or a loved one? Or are we viewed through the darker tinted lens of an opponent in life, an ex-spouse, a jilted business partner, a spurned lover? We see that in our own nation's history, don't we? We lift up Thomas Paine, the Sons of Liberty, and the Boston Tea Party as seminal to the story of our American Revolution. But how many times do we remember that when the revolution was over and a new constitution was being drafted, African slaves that had been brought to these shores were only considered to be 2/5 or 3/5 of a human being and were given no rights? Or that only white males that owned property had the right to vote? Even in our current events, if we look back to the formation of the Tea Party in 2010, we find it spoken of in terms of liberty and freedoms. The current year's storming of state legislatures by gun-carrying white citizens has been described as an exercise of freedom. Yet, a Black Lives Matter protest to demand justice for the unwarranted killings of African Americans is described as a gathering of thugs out to destroy property, people, and even destroy our democracy. A white man can carry an automatic weapon into a state legislature building, spit in the face of law enforcement officers during this COVID pandemic, and walk back out the front door without being accosted or arrested. Yet, even this week, an unarmed Black father walking back to his car and his children after helping break up a fight was shot in the back 7 times. Who lives? The white 17-year-old walking down the middle of the street after killing 2 people with an AR-15 style weapon. The white man who has shot 9 people in a church basement at the end of a group Bible study. The white men responsible for the bombing of a federal office building in Oklahoma City after killing 168 people and injuring more than 600. Who dies? George Floyd, after having a police officer kneel on his neck for almost 9 minutes, in spite of his cries that I can't breathe. Ahmaud Arbery, as he is jogging on a Sunday afternoon in a Georgia neighborhood. Breonna Taylor, as she is sleeping in her own bed at home. And there are, to our national shame, many more names. Who tells our story? How do we tell their story? If you were to observe the news, when it is a white person arrested, the story is about mental illness, a troubled teen, a troubled home. They are rarely, if ever, referred to as the domestic terrorists, white supremacist, or other fringe group that they are. The press treats those suspects with respect. But when the person is someone of color, it is as if the gloves come off and every aspect of their lives are examined for dirt of some sort to be able to say, well, what do you expect from this sort? How is it that law enforcement are able to restrain themselves around white serial killers and mass murderers, but for an African American selling loose cigarettes on the street, or allegedly passing a counterfeit $20 bill at a convenience store, jogging in a white neighborhood, or even walking away toward one's children, shoot to kill is the response? There can be no justification for these actions. The sooner our nation reforms our justice systems and we ensure that private citizens, regardless of skin color or ethnic background or religion, are given the same rights and protections as our law enforcement officers, the better we will be. Psalm 22 reads, "He did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, but heard when I cried to him." God hears the cry of the oppressed. God looks to see if we treat all our citizens with justice. The Gospels, the Hebrew Scriptures are full of the calls to justice. When the story is written of our generation in America, what will that story be? That we worked to perfect our union? That we stood up, demanded that justice be done? That we treated all of our neighbors with compassion and mercy? And that we turned toward God and were found to be authentic followers of Jesus? That is the call of the Gospels. That, my friends, would be living as true disciples of Jesus. Amen.